It is November 1853. You are standing inside a train station in Ohio, and the air smells like coal smoke, wet wool, and something indefinably anxious. Two trains are scheduled to use the same track. The station master knows this. The conductors know this. Everyone knows this. And yet the trains move toward each other anyway because the station master's clock says it is not noon yet, and the conductor's watch set 3 towns back says it already passed. These are not careless men. They are not drunk. They simply exist in a country where every city runs on its own version of time, calibrated to its own sun, agreeing with no one else. Detroit's noon is not Cleveland's noon, is not Buffalo's noon. You woke up this morning, checked your phone, and knew exactly what time it was. It was identical to your neighbor's, identical to someone 2 states away. That certainty feels like nothing. It is not nothing. Stories like these never made it into the textbooks most of us sat through. If this kind of hidden history pulls you in, you are in the right place. We find one of these every week. Subscribe so you do not miss what is coming next. Now, let's go back further, much further, because the train wreck problem was the explosion at the end of a very long fuse. And to understand it, you have to understand what human beings did for thousands of years before a single mechanical clock existed anywhere on Earth. The honest answer is that they guessed. They looked up, looked around, listened, and made their best approximation. If the sun was directly overhead, it was roughly midday. If your shadow was long and pointing west, evening was coming. If you were hungry, it was probably mealtime. If the rooster was going, something between night and morning was happening. This was not considered a failure of civilization. It was simply how time worked, felt, read from the natural world, and communicated through bells and shared routines rather than measured instruments. And here's the thing that modern brains find genuinely difficult to absorb. For most of human history, that was perfectly fine. Nobody needed to agree on the time because nobody moved fast enough for disagreement to matter. If you lived in a village, your whole world was organized around the same sun, the same season, the same set of bells rung from the same church tower. Your neighbor's sense of noon and your sense of noon were naturally synchronized because you were both standing in the same patch of earth, watching the same sky. Time didn't need to be standardized. It was local by nature, and local was enough. Sundials were the first serious attempt to do better. They appeared in ancient Egypt around 1500 BCE, and variations spread across Greece, Rome, Mesopotamia, and China over the following centuries. They were genuinely useful in their context. A sundial in a public square could tell a passerby roughly what portion of the day had elapsed, allow a merchant to know when to expect a customer, give a court a rough sense of when to convene. Roman sundials were sophisticated enough to account for the angle of the sun at different times of year. Some were small and portable, carved from stone or cast in bronze, carried by the wealthy like an early status object. But a sundial has fundamental limits that no amount of engineering refinement can overcome. It does not work at night. It does not work indoors. It does not work when the sky is overcast, which in many parts of the world means it does not work for days or weeks at a time. And it cannot be shared across distance. A sundial is measuring the sun's position at exactly one specific location. Move it 50 miles east or west, and it reads differently. The sundial was not a technology for coordination. It was a technology for observation, local and singular. The sky was the clock, and the sky was different everywhere. Water clocks, clepsydræ, tried to do something the sundial could not. They measured elapsed time without needing the sun at all. Ancient Egyptians used them as early as 1400 BCE. Greek courts used them to limit how long lawyers could speak. Chinese engineers built elaborate water clock towers of extraordinary complexity, some of them multi-story structures with mechanical figures that moved at each hour. In principle, a water clepsydra was elegant. Water drips from one vessel into another at a controlled rate, and you measure how full the lower vessel is to know how much time has passed. In practice, the problems were relentless. Water viscosity changes with temperature. A clepsydra running in a cold Roman winter drained slower than the same device in summer heat, meaning the hours it measured were literally different lengths at different times of year. The vessels accumulated mineral deposits and algae that altered the drip rate. They froze. They evaporated. They needed constant refilling and recalibration. And every time you reset one, you face the same fundamental question that dogged every timekeeping device before the mechanical clock. Reset it against what? Who is the authority? Somewhere in the system, a person had to look at the sun, which meant the sun was still the ultimate reference, and the water clock was merely a way of extending the sun's judgment through the dark hours without the sun present. There were other attempts. Candle clocks, popularized in medieval Europe, used candles of uniform thickness, marked with lines at regular intervals. If you burned down one segment, 1 hour had passed. Alfred the Great reportedly used them to organize his day. Sand hourglasses appeared in Europe around the 14th century, well suited to measuring specific short durations: a ship's watch, a sermon's length, the time a prisoner could speak in court. But none of these were tools for social coordination at scale. A candle clock in London and a candle clock in York, lit at different moments, would disagree completely. They measured duration, not shared time. Medieval life organized itself around something more communal than any of these instruments: the canonical hours of the Catholic Church, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. These 8 divisions of the day structured monastic life, and because monasteries anchored European communities, they structured village life as well. Church bells rang the hours, and people organized their days around those bells. Go to market at terce, return before vespers, pray at compline. Time was social, negotiated, announced by sound rather than read from a face. But there's a detail here that almost nobody knows, and it's strange enough to stop you. The canonical hours were not fixed to the clock. They were proportional to daylight. The day was divided into 12 equal hours, but those hours stretched in summer, when daylight was long, and shrank in winter when it was short. A summer hour and a winter hour in medieval Europe were genuinely different durations. Noon, sext the 6th hour, fell at solar midday, which meant it occurred at a different point on any clock every single day of the year. When the bells rang, they were not announcing a fixed moment. They were announcing a relationship between humans and the sun, and that relationship changed constantly. This is where a forgotten occupation enters the picture. Medieval monasteries and cathedral towns employed a figure called the horologer, sometimes the sacristan, sometimes a dedicated lay official, whose entire job was to watch the sundial and ring the bells at the correct moment. No instrument, no dial, no mechanism. Just a person outside staring at a gnome's shadow, making a judgment call. When clouds came, the horologer guessed. When he slept through matins, the monks prayed late. The entire temporal rhythm of a community rested on one person's interpretation of the sky. It was this problem, keeping monks to a precise prayer schedule regardless of weather, season, or the horologer's alertness, that created the unlikely pressure for a real breakthrough. Monasteries needed regularity badly enough to start engineering for it. And sometime around the late 13th century, in Europe, something new appeared. The exact inventor and exact date remain uncertain, but by roughly 1280 to 1300, records begin describing mechanical clocks in English and Italian cathedrals. These were tower clocks, enormous and expensive, built of iron, driven by hanging weights, and controlled by a mechanism called the verge and foliot escapement. The escapement is the beating heart of a mechanical clock, the device that takes a continuous pulling force and breaks it into discrete, regulated steps. Without an escapement, a weighted gear simply spins until the weight hits the floor. With one, the gear advances in tiny, controlled increments, each one tick, each one measurable. The Virgin Foliot escapement was crude by later standards. A horizontal bar with small weights at each end that oscillated back and forth, catching and releasing a toothed crown wheel. It worked. It kept time through clouds, through night, through winter, through everything a sundial could not manage. It also lost between 15 and 60 minutes per day. Early mechanical clocks were, by our standards, spectacularly inaccurate. They had no minute hands, partly because minutes were not considered worth the engineering, and partly because the clocks were not accurate enough to make a minute hand meaningful. They announced the hours. That was the aspiration. A clock that kept time within an hour was a good clock. This was the state of the art. Most people never owned one. Early tower clocks were civic or ecclesiastical infrastructure, built for the public square or the cathedral facade. The wealthy eventually acquired smaller portable clocks, beautiful, expensive, intricate objects that appeared in illuminated manuscripts and royal inventories. But these were status symbols first. A nobleman displaying a mechanical clock in his chambers was displaying money and sophistication, not necessarily consulting the time. The mechanisms were too unreliable for precision and too expensive for the practical classes. And then things got worse, or rather a new problem came into focus that made all the imprecisions suddenly catastrophic. Europeans were sailing, not just across the Mediterranean, but into open ocean out of sight of land, dependent on navigational calculations that required something nobody could reliably provide: an accurate measurement of time aboard a ship in motion. The problem was longitude. Calculating where you were east or west on the open ocean required knowing the exact difference between local noon and noon at a fixed reference point. And knowing that meant carrying a clock set to home time and reading it at sea precisely, consistently for weeks or months, across rolling waves, through salt air and freezing nights and equatorial heat. No clock built before the mid-17th century could survive a sea voyage without losing enough time to make its readings useless. In the 1650s, the Dutch scientist Christian Huygens built the first practical pendulum clock, applying an insight that Galileo had described observationally decades earlier: that a pendulum's swing is isochronous, meaning its period stays nearly constant regardless of how wide the arc. Huygens' pendulum clock was a revolution in accuracy. Suddenly, clocks were keeping time to within seconds per day, not minutes. For land-based timekeeping, this was transformative. For navigation, it solved nothing. A pendulum on a ship is a pendulum being tossed by waves. The rolling motion added and subtracted from the swing, corrupting the period, destroying the accuracy. Every test ended in failure. The most precise land clock in Europe became useless the moment it crossed the gangway. Ships kept wrecking on coasts nobody could correctly locate. Fleets were lost. Sailors died by the hundreds, then the thousands. The longitude problem was officially unsolvable. At least that is what everyone who mattered believed. The solution, when it came, arrived from the least expected direction. Not from a royal astronomer or a university mathematician or a naval engineer. From a carpenter in a small English town who had taught himself to build clocks from wood, and who decided the establishment was wrong. That story is where we go next. John Harrison was a carpenter's son from Lincolnshire who had no formal scientific training, no university degree, and no wealthy patron propping him up from the start. He was self-taught in clockmaking, the way people in that era learned most things, by taking things apart, rebuilding them, failing, and trying again. By the time he began seriously pursuing the longitude problem in the 1720s, he was already building some of the most accurate pendulum clocks in England. But he understood, better than almost anyone, why accurate pendulum clocks were useless for the actual problem that was costing lives. That problem was navigation. Specifically, the inability of any ship's navigator to determine longitude, their east-west position, while at sea. Latitude was manageable. You could read your latitude from the angle of the sun at noon. Longitude required something different. You needed to know the exact time at a fixed reference point, Greenwich say, and compare it to the local time wherever you were. The difference in time told you how far east or west you had traveled. 1 hour of difference equaled 15 degrees of longitude. The math was simple. The execution was not. To do it, you needed a clock accurate enough to carry aboard a ship for months without losing more than a few seconds. No such clock existed. The British Parliament had been dangling a solution in front of the scientific community since 1714. The Longitude Prize was £20,000 for a method that could determine a ship's longitude at sea to within half a degree. That was an enormous sum, equivalent to several $1 million today. It had attracted astronomers, mathematicians, and dreamers of every variety. Most of the scientific establishment believed the answer would come from the sky, from tables of lunar distances, from astronomical observation. A self-taught carpenter chasing it with a mechanical box was not, in anyone's estimation, a serious contender. Harrison spent decades on the problem. His first marine timekeeper, H1, was completed in 1735. It was a remarkable object. Large, gleaming, full of interlocking brass components designed to cancel out the temperature changes and pitch and roll motion that destroyed pendulum accuracy. It performed well enough on a trial voyage to Lisbon that the Board of Longitude gave him money to keep going. H2 followed. Then H3, which occupied 19 years of his life and incorporated a bimetallic temperature compensation strip that would later become standard in watchmaking. Each version solved problems, and each version revealed new ones. Then, in a move that surprised nearly everyone who had been following his work, Harrison abandoned the large format entirely. H4, completed in 1759, looked like a pocket watch. It was 5 inches across. It had a white enamel dial, a jeweled movement, and a high-frequency balance wheel that made it extraordinarily resistant to the motion of a ship. On its trial voyage to Jamaica in 1761, it lost 5 seconds over 81 days at sea. The longitude problem, the problem that had wrecked fleets, drowned sailors, and embarrassed the most powerful maritime nation on Earth for centuries, was solved by a mechanism small enough to fit in a coat pocket. Here is where the story should end in triumph. It does not. The man responsible for evaluating Harrison's solution was Neville Maskelyne, the astronomer royal, who had spent his career developing the competing lunar distance method. He was not a villain in the cartoon sense. He was a serious scientist with real convictions. But his conflict of interest was severe. He was both a competitor to Harrison and one of the primary judges of the Longitude Prize, a situation that would be considered disqualifying by any modern standard. Maskelyne dismissed H4's trial results as insufficiently verified. He demanded new trials under conditions Harrison considered rigged. He championed his own nautical almanac, published in 1767, as a workable alternative that required no expensive clockwork at all. Harrison fought for years. He wrote furious pamphlets. He appealed directly to King George III, who listened, had H4 tested in his own private observatory, and reportedly told Harrison that he had been treated with great injustice. Parliament finally authorized full payment in 1773. Harrison was 80 years old. He died 3 years later. The technology survived him. Within decades, marine chronometers built on Harrison's principles were standard equipment on British naval vessels. James Cook carried copies on his second and third voyages. By the early 19th century, the price had dropped enough for merchant ships to carry them routinely. Accurate portable timekeeping existed. The question now was what happened when that accuracy met everyday life on land. The answer started with railroads, and it started badly. By the 1840s, Britain's expanding rail network was running into a problem that felt almost absurd from a modern vantage point. Every town set its clocks to local solar time. Bristol's noon was 10 minutes behind London's noon. A railway timetable that said a train departed at 9 o'clock and arrived at 11:30 meant something different at every stop along the route, depending on whose clock you consulted. Conductors carried their own watches set to the departure city's time. Station clocks ran on local time. Passengers interpreted everything through whatever time they personally believed it was. Scheduling was not merely difficult, it was conceptually broken. The Great Western Railway solved it by executive decision in 1840. They adopted Greenwich Mean Time for their entire network, company-wide, regardless of local solar conditions. No parliamentary act required it. No public vote approved it. A private company simply decided that one standard time was worth more than perfect local accuracy and ran with it. The results were immediate and practical enough that other railways followed. By 1855, roughly 98% of Britain's public clocks were running on Greenwich Mean Time, not because the law required it, but because the alternative was chaos, and chaos was now moving at 30 miles an hour. The American version of this crisis was, characteristically, bigger and more stubborn. The United States in the 1870s had over 300 distinct local times operating across its railroad network. This was not a metaphor or an approximation. There were literally more than 300 different clocks that trains were expected to honor. The situation was dangerous enough that on November 18, 1883, the major American railroads did something that no government body had ordered them to do. They divided the country into 4 standard time zones and reset their clocks accordingly, effective that day at noon. In some cities, clocks were set back. In others, forward. In certain places, noon arrived twice, the railroad's new noon and the sun's old one. People called it the Day of Two Noons. The public reaction was not entirely grateful. There was genuine unease, a feeling difficult to articulate but powerfully felt, that someone was tampering with something sacred. Ministers in some congregations preached against it. Newspaper editorials complained about Vanderbilt time, the implication being that railroad executives were now deciding what time it was for ordinary citizens who had no say in the matter. The state of Indiana would refuse to cooperate with daylight saving time extensions well into the 21st century, a grudge with roots traceable to that original 19th century resentment. The federal government did not legally standardize American time zones until the Standard Time Act of 1918, 35 years after the railroads had already done it practically. But the legal debate obscured what was already happening on the ground. Synchronized time had entered ordinary life, and it was changing things that had nothing to do with trains. Factory shift work had always existed in rough form, but the mechanical clock, and now the synchronized clock, made it enforceable in a completely new way. A worker who arrived when the sun seemed right could no longer be evaluated against an objective standard. Now there was one. The punch clock, introduced in the 1880s, recorded arrival time to the minute. Tardiness became a measurable, finable offense. Punctuality became a moral quality, a sign of reliability, discipline, and respect. Employers used this language enthusiastically. The worker who was on time was a good worker. The one who was not just inconvenient, they were morally deficient. Before standardized time, these concepts were nearly incoherent. Lateness requires an agreed-upon moment to be late to. Without synchronized clocks, that agreement could not exist. Medicine changed in quieter but equally significant ways. The concept of a dosing interval, take this every 4 hours, requires those 4 hours to mean the same thing to the patient at home, the physician who prescribed it, and the apothecary who dispensed it. Before synchronized time, even this small coordination was approximate. As clock ownership spread into middle-class households through the 19th century, and as those clocks ran on the same standard as the city's public clocks and the doctor's pocket watch, medical instructions became something a patient could actually follow with precision. The interval was real. The timing was shared. This seems trivially small until you consider how many drug interactions, dosing errors, and treatment failures have timing at their root. Sleep shifted in ways we are still living with. For most of human history, sleep followed light. People rose near dawn, rested in some cultures during midday heat, and slept when darkness made activity impractical. Artificial light disrupted this. Synchronized clock time finished it. Once your employer, your school, your transportation network, and your neighbors were all coordinating around a shared clock rather than around the sun, your body's schedule became secondary. The clock decided when morning was. Your biology could object, but it could not override. We now have a significant body of research linking the mismatch between clock time and solar time, particularly in winter months at northern latitudes, to sleep disruption, mood disorders, and metabolic irregularities. The clock gave us coordination and took something in exchange. We accepted the trade so gradually that most people don't know a trade was made. What the mechanical clock ultimately built was not just a timekeeping infrastructure. It built a shared version of reality. When you and your neighbor and someone in a distant city all agree that it is 9:47 in the morning, you are agreeing on something that has no physical presence. You cannot touch it, weigh it, or see it. You are agreeing to inhabit the same abstract framework together simultaneously. That agreement is so complete now, so automatic, that we have no felt sense of its strangeness. It is simply how the world works. But it is not how the world naturally works, it is how the world was made to work by a sequence of inventions, accidents, commercial pressures, maritime disasters, political arguments, and one stubborn clockmaker from Lincolnshire, who built the solution in a box the size of a grapefruit and still had to appeal to the king to get paid. Before all of that, time was local. It was personal. It was negotiated. You were never late because nobody agreed on when anything was supposed to start. That world sounds almost peaceful, until you remember the ships without longitude, the trains on the same track, the patients who couldn't follow their doctor's instructions, and the darkness that fell before anyone had finished what needed doing. The clock didn't just measure time. It made time something we could share. And everything that followed, the schedules, the shifts, the coordination, the modern world's entire operating logic, ran on that shared foundation, quietly, invisibly, every second of every day.